This is Corinne.
And this is Ayani.
And you're listening to Sex, Love, Literature, a pop culture podcast where we take a semi-scholarly look at why
and how
the sex stuff in media matters.
We're tackling a big topic this time in a two-part discussion on the female gaze. What is the female gaze, and why does it matter?
In our first episode, we established some context for the term by getting into the history of the gaze as a concept, the psychoanalytic origins of the male gaze, and how the oppositional gaze, as coined by theorist and scholar Bell Hooks, makes space for alternative ways of looking and being looked at.
If you enjoyed us really leaning into an academic vibe this time, let us know on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads at SexLoveLit.
Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of your other favorite podcast platforms.
And remember to tune into part 2 of our discussion.
As a note, this episode was recorded during the 2023 WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes. Without the labor of the writers and actors currently on strike, along with their counterparts in other countries who also deserve fair wages and labor protections, none of the works we discuss here or in other episodes would exist.
All right, let's dive in. Well, hello there, SLL listeners.
Hi.
Welcome to another episode of Sex, Love, Literature. We are so excited to have you all with us today. And this episode is actually kind of special because it marks the first episode that we have done together in which we are both doctors.
Yay!
That's kind of exciting. So no, you don't have to start calling us Dr. Cooper and Dr. Matthews. I think that'd be weird. I still don't recognize when people are like Dr. Cooper. I'm like, who's that? I don't know. But I don't know. That feels kind of exciting. I feel like over the course of this podcast, we've gone through a lot, especially since it started at the start of the Panini, and yeah, so this kind of feels like a major milestone markery kind of thing to me.
Yeah, well, Ayani has been Dr. Cooper for a year. I'm the one who is recently defended. But for a little bit of context for people not super familiar with academia, the milestone that I have finally passed is that I defended my dissertation, which is a book-length project on an academic topic. We'll probably do another episode coming up where we sort of reintroduce ourselves and might talk a little bit about our dissertations. But all you need to know for now is that we are finally done, or both done, with our PhDs.
Yeah, which is wild to me. And by the time this episode comes out, you might have graduated and been hooded and stuff, which is exciting. Do you want to give context for hooding, and then we can move on?
I mean, I don't know how exciting it is. So it's like
I was very excited when it happened.
Okay, well, Ayani has always wanted to get a PhD specifically for the puffy hat.
I love my hat. It's hanging on my mirror.
I am less motivated by clothing items than she is. But yeah, so when you graduate with your PhD, you get hooded by your advisor. So it's like a hood. It's not like a hood that goes over your head, although maybe it might have been inspired by that. I don't know. But it like hangs. It hangs like around the front of your neck, down your back, and it's kind of like being knighted, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, some people actually get swords in other countries when they defend.
Yeah, so we picked the wrong country to get our PhDs in.
I mean, I'm not going to do it again, but also the hats in other countries are pretty great as well. So, once is enough. Once is enough as far as a PhD is concerned. So yeah. This is kind of an exciting episode. I'm excited for Corinne. It's fun to be Dr. Cooper and Dr. Matthews. And yeah, I just felt like I should shout that out at the start of this episode, especially since this episode in particular is going to, in a lot of ways, be pulling on our expertise as academics. I know we've done episodes like that before. I think Promising Young Woman leaned in a lot to your expertise as a consent scholar. I think the sex education episodes are like that a bit as well. So this is another where we're definitely going to be trying to pull pull on kind of those threads of our, I don't know, academic expertise, if that's fair
Although
to
I
say.
will also say, so I've already introduced the topic and the like intro, but
Right.
the term that we're getting into, female gaze, is one that has crossed over a bit from the like
Mhm.
academic to the more like pop culture,
Yeah.
general, like popular analysis kind of space.
Mhm.
So it's
Absolutely.
probably something you've certainly heard of the male gaze before. And by gaze, I mean GAZE, not the male GAYS. Just, in case you are
No,
like
it's
me and heard that for a while and we're like, why are we always talking about the male gaze?
it seems a little like targeted,
Yeah,
and an odd way to phrase it too,
it's
but
like a weird way to put it, but okay. Anyway, before we get into that,
Ooh, sorry, that was funny. I was coming down from that. I was gonna segue, but the laugh was still in my throat. Please continue.
but before we get into that, we will do our regular segment called What's Sparking Joy, which is where I always say briefly, and I don't know that it always ends up being brief.
No, I think brief is a lie. We have often lied about things being brief, and this is one of them. But
yeah, but we talk sometimes at length about a piece of pop culture that we are reading, watching, or listening to that is currently sparking joy for us. I do want to note that because we are recording this as the actors and writers strike is going on, that we are trying to be careful about what things we plug and promote on
Yes.
the podcast. So that affects what we're going to mention as what's sparking joy for us. Yeah, I keep wanting to say striking. Like
What's striking joy?
What's striking joy? That is a very active verb, but maybe not what I'm going for. But anyway, so just we included something about that at the beginning of the show, but just as a reminder, solidarity with actors and writers. We very much support the strike, but also still like pop culture. And we're also more of an analysis podcast than a promotional one. So that is something that we're thinking about.
Yeah, and we're kind of trying to navigate in the upcoming episodes. But anyhow, I guess I'll go first since you did the What's Sparking Joy introduction. And what is sparking joy for me right now is an anime that came out maybe a season or two ago. I think it wrapped up last season, but it's the most recent Gundam series, The Witch from Mercury. And my spouse Andrew has been telling me that I would love this series, and he constantly is like, Ayani, you should be watching The Witch from Mercury. And I'm like, I don't know, I'm watching like 15 things and then a K-drama and then a podcast that I have to do, so I don't know. But finally, one day at dinner, I was like, you know what, okay, we'll watch The Witch from Mercury. And I really like it. It's a lot of fun. For a super, super quick synopsis, it's about a young girl named Suleta and her Gundam. I'm gonna mispronounce it because I want to say Ariel, but it's like Aeriel, like Aerial.
I cannot help you.
And she goes to I'm not expecting your assistance with this one. And she goes to kind of like Gundam battle school, in which people are being trained to both be Gundam pilots, but also mechanics and work in marketing and all that kind of stuff. And she gets wrapped up in the ins and outs of Gundam school, which is directly tied to the ins and outs of like the big mega corporations that kind of run space right now. So it is, as most Gundam series are, future science fiction, but anytime I see mega corporations and like the head of the mega corporation is the president of the mega corporation, I don't know, it there are definitely analogies to our current lived experiences. But anyhow, it's super delightful. The main character, it's funny, she is really trying hard. She's a great pilot, but she has a lot of social anxiety. So whenever she pushes herself to like say, hey, that's not right, or to try to meet a new friend, she's always stuttering and very nervous about it. And it's like mood. I relate. I actually said, I think after we watched the first episode, I turned to Andrew and I was like, I need to be more like Suleta, that when I'm nervous about something, I should go for it and just say it, even if the words don't come out all the way. So I feel a kinship with this nervous Gundam pilot. Also, she's a redhead, but it seems like she's a natural redhead, unlike me, who is a redhead for pretend. But anyhow, so The Witch from Mercury is bringing me a lot of joy. I think if you all are following us on Threads, which is a place you can follow us right now, we were also talking about the fact that we started watching Vincenzo, and which is a K-drama, a gangster K-drama, which I'm not going to get into a lot right now. But there was just a big reveal in Vincenzo, and Corinne is ahead of me, and so I can text her everything that I feel about it. So yeah, those will be my two. So Gundam, The Witch from Mercury, and Vincenzo are sparking joy for me.
Yeah, Vincenzo, for those of you unfamiliar with K-dramas, started and finished airing in, I think, 2020 or 2021.
I think 2021, yeah.
It's a completed K-drama that a lot of people really, really love that we're getting to kind of late. I know I didn't pick it up because I thought the premise sounded a little silly.
I mean, it is a little silly. That's not wrong.
But we were watching because Ayani came down to Florida for my defense, and we were watching it, and Andrew, her spouse, asked us, like, is this a comedy? And I was like, no. Well, Ayani was like, yes. So the genre is, as with most K-dramas, there's a lot of genre bending and mixing happening, but it's very fun. We're late to the party, but we're glad we're there.
Yes. Actually, randomly, really quickly, not to cut off your joy being sparked here, but something, sorry, this was just on my mind because you were talking about the Florida trip. Apparently, our voices are hard to tell apart. And I did not know this until that Florida trip, which it was mentioned to us. How many people? I know one of your besties said that she can't tell us apart on the podcast. And then Andrew said,
she was watching Hit the Spot because she listened to our Hit the Spot episodes. And then it was like, yeah, I agree with Ayani about like this point that she made. And I was like, that was me. So sorry to our listeners that our voices are apparently the same. We should have thought about that before we started a podcast.
Our laughs are different, though. That's how they know. Oh, anyhow, Corinne.
Oh, the term she used to differentiate them. She said that my laugh was witchier.
I think that's a compliment. You should take it that way.
I mean, I'm choosing to take it as one, but also, like, that is a statement.
Oh, that's funny.
All right.
What's sparking joy for you?
So what's sparking joy for me is something that I have perhaps mentioned on the podcast before.
Maybe once or twice.
Or multiple, I don't know, it's fine. But it is the C-drama, The Story of Minglan, which, because I am visiting my parents for a couple of weeks, I have persuaded my mother to watch with me. So The Story of Minglan is, I think, well, it's certainly my favorite C-drama I've ever seen, and it is also, I think, one of my favorite, if not my favorite show that I've ever seen from any country.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, I'm realizing that. I already kind of maybe thought that was the case, but upon rewatching it, this is my first rewatch because it is 73 episodes long.
It's a long one.
Watching it is a commitment, so I've only watched it once. So this is my first rewatch, and it's just so smart and clever, and there are seeds that were planted very early on in the drama that like don't come back to sprout for like 40 or 50 episodes that I'm like seeing now, and I'm like, oh, I get it. And it was also great the first time I watched it. But so The Story of Minglan is set in about the year 1200 in one of the Chinese dynasties. I think it's the Song dynasty. I could be mistaken. But it is about Minglan, who is the daughter of an unfavored concubine, who her mother dies fairly early in the drama, and it is about her sort of struggle to survive the awful, deceptively dangerous shenanigans, for lack of a better word, but shenanigans sounds too fun for what's happening in the inner courtyard of her family house. Her father is a mid-level bureaucrat. I think what is one of the things that is very interesting about this drama is it's not like a palace drama. So it's not like thinking about the emperor, and the politics certainly come into it. But because Minglan is like in such a interesting position socially. She's a very, very interesting character to watch. And then her love interest is also very fun. His name is Gu Tingyi, and he has a reputation for being, I think the word they use a lot is hedonistic.
Oh boy.
Son, heir
It's a
to
good word.
heir to a marquis, so he's at a much higher social class, but it is the slowest of slow burns, but it is so, so rewarding when they finally get married and like seeing them become a team as well as like a convincing romantic couple. So Story of Minglan, I think it aired in 2019, so it's a little bit on the older side now, but it is super, super good. Highly recommend. Very well plotted, very well paced for something that is so long. And the costumes are gorgeous. I was just watching an episode where they have a polo match. Well, because they apparently polo was there's another name for it in Mandarin, but polo was apparently invented in China 1,000 years ago.
Did not know this.
That is super, super fun to watch, especially since the women also play. Oh, also the description that I've heard of Minglan that I am going to share to sell it to some of our listeners is it's like if you like Jane Austen, but you would like the social rules to be even more complicated and also for sometimes there to be murder, then this is the show for you.
Yeah, I know most people do come to the Jane Austen text for the murder specifically, so,
Anyway, so that was a not that brief What's Sparking Joy.
Oh, no, we have definitely done longer What's Sparking Joys, so don't beat yourself up. So shifting into our main conversation, Corinne and I wanted to take some time this episode to talk about the female gaze, right? What is the female gaze? Why does this term exist? Why is it used frequently in conversations about media? It feels like the kind of term, and Corinne, feel free to jump in here because I know in part the impetus for this episode was some of your thoughts about how it's being used culturally. But it's the kind of term I feel like that has a lot of a lot of background, but no clear definition. And that to me makes it kind of interesting because it's tied to all of this kind of like deep academic context, but does not really have a clear definition in the way it's being used kind of pop culture generally.
Yeah. So part of the reason that I kind of wanted to do this episode is what I've been hearing it used in contradictory ways that I think that I think could use some complication. So like, for example, I've heard the female gaze to use things women like, which I don't know, to me is sort of lacks the specificity of the use of the term gaze. I also read another definition that suggested that the female gaze is how women see women and it's for their personalities for some reason.
That's weird. Okay.
Yeah, so even if you just like Google the female gaze, there are a ton of results, but there's not really a sort of clear consensus of what it means. So I thought it would be interesting for us to spend some time thinking about the history of the term the gaze and how the female gaze has sort of like popped up and what not to toot our own horns a little bit, but like what we think the female gaze means.
Right.
Or what we should be thinking about when we think about the female gaze.
Yeah. And I don't think we are going to come to like a definitive answer. Like, this is the definition that you should use. I mean, no, it's not that kind of a, number one, it's not that kind of a podcast. But also, I think conversationally, it's more complex than one I would feel comfortable giving a very definitive definition to. But I think your kind of use of complicate and complication is really important here because something I hope we get to is like complicating the use in our modern era of the female or the male gaze altogether, right? But that's, we'll see how this conversation goes and if we actually get there. Not to like throw a disclaimer in, but part of the reason that we're doing this is that in working on my dissertation, I did a keyword essay on the female gaze that I kind of wrote and then forgot about. But then when we were going to do this episode, kind of brought it back up again. And it's a really interesting conversation And on top of that, I just kind of want to say, while I've written about it, I'm not, I don't know, this isn't my exact area of expertise, if that makes sense. You'll
It's
kind of
closer to
see.
your area of expertise than mine.
No, you're right. But you'll kind of see as we start peeling back the layers. Like, one of the things I think we're going to dive into in a little bit is that the gaze itself as a term has a lot of legs in psychoanalysis, and that is something that,
Mhm.
because of the kind of research that I do, I have to do reading in, but it's not necessarily like where I live. It's not, it's not my jam, so to speak. But I kind of have to know it exists and who exists in those frames. So just something to keep in mind as we're moving through. So I guess we can just start. Unless are there anything else up front that you want to say before we dive in?
No, I
Is
think,
it
I think that was us starting, actually.
Oh, womp, LOL. Yeah, we started. Ha 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 ha. So
So, to kind of give an overview of how we see this conversation going, we're going to sort of break the female gaze down into parts. So, first, we're going to think about what the gaze is, where the
Mhm.
idea comes from, what that sort of encompasses, and then we'll think about a little bit about the terms of the male gaze and the oppositional gaze
Mhm.
before we get into the female gaze specifically, because the female gaze didn't just pop up by
Right.
itself, it specifically came up in response to these
Mhm.
other
Mhm.
terms. So, but before we get to specific kinds of gazes, what is the gaze, Aoni? What is that? What does that sort of encompass or invoke?
Yeah. So that's a really big question.
Yes.
That's a really big question, and not to undercut myself, but there are a lot of smart people who have had smart conversations about
Okay.
what the gaze is.
Stop
Um
saying that you don't know anything, Aoni.
Okay, you're right. You're right. I know things. I do know things, and I'm literally about to quote myself to prove how I know things.
As
Um,
previously established, we are both doctors
no, you're
now.
right. You're right. I need to stop undercutting myself. But one of the things that I did in my dissertation is kind of tried to figure out how to do a really quick gloss of the gaze to give kind of a sense of how it works. So the way that I thought about it in that project was kind of thinking of the gaze as a quote unquote background radiation of subjectivity, or the camera behind our eyes that constructs the understanding of media. So to kind of break that down a little bit, I'm thinking more of like, this is going to sound, I'm going to try to make an analogy here, but kind of like living in a society, right? You get a lot of input and a lot of information from a variety of different sources. And
Mhm.
thinking about the gaze is kind of like the way we gather all of that data that we're living with and living in, and use that to process what we are looking at. So it's kind of like the camera behind the camera, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so, like, sending that back to you, I guess.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's kind of like how we are trained to read and process images that we see, right?
Right, exactly. And it's kind of like that script that's just running constantly. So the example that I used in my project, because I was talking a bit about how we understand pornography, right?
Also, for
Is
context, Ayani is a comics and animation scholar, so
Oh,
she looked
that's
at
right.
specifically a lot of comics in her dissertation.
Yes, yes. A lot of, I think, visual media is an important way to
Yeah.
kind of put it. Things that are used in pictures. And I was thinking a lot about like erotics and pornography, and using the gaze to kind of be like, it's difficult. It's really difficult to give a succinct, easy to understand definition of pornography because it's really complicated.
Mhm.
And as we see with kind of what's happening with book bannings right now, right? It's easy
Mhm.
to stretch pornography into a variety of different ways, or a variety of different meanings. But we get kind of background radiation information about what erotics are and what it means to be erotic. So if you're presented with an image, right? How you perceive that image as erotic or not erotic or pornographic is based on all of the information you've been gathering societally.
Mhm.
And then that's filtered through your individual perspective. So that's kind of an example that I would use for thinking about how the gaze works. The eyes behind your eyes, the camera
Mhm.
behind the camera.
Yeah. I'd also maybe, and correct me if you
Mm,
disagree, but I think we can also sort of break the gaze down. The three things that the gaze sort of takes into account are who is being looked at, who is looking, and like what lens they are looking through. Is that too simple?
No, it's not that it's too simple, and I'm gonna kinda drop this and then maybe we can move on from it because it's a lot of layers, but when we think about the gaze, it's not so much thinking about the individual perspective.
Mhm.
It's more thinking about I don't know. I'm moving my arms and you all can't see me doing that on a podcast, but I feel like there's more there's more of a conversation of kind of mm, large swaths or large groups of people. But I think
Yeah,
ultimately
it's
you are
more
right.
about the assumed viewer rather than, like,
Right. An
Corinne
individual perspective.
Matthews, who was looking
Yes.
at Gu Tingyi on Minglan. That's not the gaze. It's more who is the assumed viewer of this C-drama.
Right. 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 So yes. Yes.
All right, so rather than staying broad, we're gonna zoom into something a little bit more specific, because the gaze is huge. So to start,
Yes.
we're gonna think about the male gaze, which
Yes.
I believe is kind of where we started. We being scholars started thinking about the gaze at all.
That's not quite accurate.
Okay, never mind.
However, no, no, no. However, I will say I think the male gaze is the place where the gaze really took off in a pop
Mm,
culture sense. So I feel like it's not the only place, obviously, right? And we're not talking with like libraries in front of us where we can source everything. But the male gaze as a concept is one that like pop psychology really latched onto
yeah, it's
and
one of
ran
those like
with.
it's one of those rare terms that crossed over from academic criticism and scholarship to like the general public.
Yeah, and it's not actually, it's not 100% unheard of, in part because I think the male gaze and I'll rewind this and give some context, but a lot of that conversation in the article that is kind of like the trope codifier for the male gaze, let's say, pulls on Freud, and Freud is someone who, from a pop psychology standpoint, is huge. People still are using Freud in pop psychology to describe certain things, like the id, the ego, the superego, the Oedipal complex, all that kind of stuff.
Okay, so for context, the
Yes, let's
article
rewind.
the article Ayani I think is so the problem here is that Ayani knows a lot. She knows
I
way
know
more
too
about this
much.
than I do. So she's getting a little bit lost in the weeds. So I will, as the resident dumb person here who
Hey,
doesn't know
hey,
as much
hold on. If I'm not allowed to talk down to myself, you're not allowed to do it either, okay? We're both
Okay.
doctors now.
As the non-expert in this subject. So this idea of the male gaze comes, I think, largely from Laura Mulvey's article, Visual Pleasure and Narrative
Mhm,
Cinema. And
mhm.
it has since become a much more expansive term, but she originally was using it to mean something very, very specific in the context
Yes.
of a few specific films and using psychoanalysis, Freudian
Yes.
psychoanalysis
Mhm,
specifically.
mhm.
We are not going to get super into the psychoanalysis stuff
Nope.
because that's not our bag. And also, I don't like Freud. So that's a personal preference.
You don't wanna talk about phalluses, Corinne? No?
I do not wish to do that. No, thank you. Uh, but when Laura Mulvey is talking about the male gaze, so a quote that Ayani has pulled here onto our outline that we have is it so she says that in a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active slash male and passive slash female. The
Mhm,
determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly.
mhm.
So she's writing specifically and claiming, I think, that narrative cinema and mainstream cinema
Right.
specifically, she's sort of putting
Mhm.
aside independent cinema when she's
Right.
writing this,
Mhm.
is meant for a male viewer to look
Right.
at female characters, I suppose, as passive subjects.
Right.
And she's both thinking about the way that they are depicted on screen, and
Mhm.
she also thinks a little bit about narrative here, right?
Right. Mhm. And kind of adding on to that, one of the claims that she makes is that the whole or the main purpose of the woman on screen is to provide an erotic spectacle. So even in a non-erotic moment, right? Just the
Mhm.
woman being there, the purpose of that is for her to be looked at and kind of fantasized about. there's a term that she uses, to be looked at-ness, that I think is kind of a fun phrase, because it's really focusing on the fact that the whole purpose to Mulvey in this article of the woman being there is to be looked at for the pleasure of looking at her. Yeah. And she even calls up like pinups and striptease and things like that in this context. But as you were saying, the main focus of her argument is narrative cinema.
Yeah. So some sort of key concepts here that I would maybe flag here is that like to be looked at-ness, that she defines pretty much all women in cinema as like a trait that they're not a trait, maybe a characterization or a character identifier that they have, or a purpose, I guess.
Purpose, I think. Yeah, let's go with purpose.
And another is she also talks about pleasure in looking. There's a specific term for that, right?
Yeah, it's a scopophilic pleasure, I believe.
Yeah, so scopophilia.
Scopophilia, yeah.
And she basically says that there is both like the assumed male viewer of the film, but sort of complicated by like the editing traditions and filmmaking traditions in which they are trying to draw your attention away from the constructedness of film, and it's supposed to feel natural. So it is supposed to feel natural that men are the ones looking. And this is a little bit where narrative comes into it, and this is, I think, where a lot of people tend to move away from Mulvey a little bit, but she assumes that like the main male character is the one that viewers project themselves onto and identify with, and when that male character looks at the female character, so like an example of a film she uses is Vertigo, Hitchcock's Vertigo. She specifically thinks about like the narrative ways in which the viewer is meant to associate and identify with the main male character rather than the female one.
Yeah, and I think that's perhaps one of the things that gets lost in when we move the male gaze away from Mulvey into kind of like a more pop culture context, is it's not just that a man made this film, so it's the male gaze, right? It's about how all of these structures are in place that assume a male viewer and a male viewership, and then interpolate viewers into that position.
Even female viewers, even viewers who are not this assumed male audience.
Right. So I'm trying to word this carefully, but it's not just like, oh man, the camera has panned over a hot woman and thusly that is the male gaze. There's a lot of different layers to that conversation that can kind of complicate how we're looking at a sequence like that.
I do still think it is inherent in the male gaze to have like the objectification of women, especially when they are positioned as passive, both in like how they are seen and how they are characterized in the narrative. So like objectification is part of it, but it's not the whole thing. It is also dependent on these other larger structures.
Yeah. And I guess something that I don't know, that I try to complicate in thinking about the male gaze is how we think about objectification, right? Because usually in these contexts, it's like, someone's objectified, that's bad. And I think it's because objectification is linked with passivity and is also linked with how then that character is treated because they are objectified, right? And I'm trying not to jump ahead because, as you said, sometimes I'm getting kind of like in the weeds here, but I think, I don't know. I think that's something that kind of needs to be interrogated, right? Especially as we think about the female gaze, right? Or as we think about what does it mean to not assume that the viewer is male as we're moving into more modern context, as we're moving into more modern films. And I will say, Mulvey doesn't really think about race in her essay.
Thinking here then, which Ayani has started doing about some of the limitations of Mulvey, are some of the assumptions that she is making about, or perhaps some of the unstated assumptions, like specifically about race. A lot of like her assumed, she never talks about race, but her assumed viewer here is not just male, which is largely what she focuses on.
Right.
He is also white and straight.
Right. Exactly.
So when we add intersectionality, I suppose, into the
Mhm.
conversation. There are other factors here beyond straight man looks at, or white straight man looks at white straight woman.
Right. And I will say, even when she broadens the conversation to women specifically in her follow-up essay, it still feels like white straight women that she's talking
Hmm.
about, who are then kind of, I think part of her argument is they take on masculinity, right? Which I don't necessarily agree with, but
Yeah. So,
yeah.
what moving then into our next sort of term that we're thinking about, which is in some ways a response to Mulvey, but also complicating the gaze as
Mhm.
something more generally, is Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks's term, the oppositional gaze,
Right.
and this comes from, was it a book chapter or an article?
I think this was a book chapter. The version I have is a book chapter, let's say.
But called the oppositional gaze, Black female spectators.
Mhm.
So, what made you want to talk about the oppositional gaze in your keyword essay, Ayani? What were you trying
Mm.
to add by looking at it?
That's a good question. Also, can I just say you're the MVP for, like, keeping this episode on rails? Because if it were up to me, I'd be like, "And then that's why." So, good for you. Good on you. Yeah, no, so part of the reason that I wanted to make sure I mentioned the oppositional gaze is in part because the thrust of my conversation was broadening out the conversation, and
Mhm.
really thinking about all of the different ways that people have interpreted and thought about what I call sexualized gazes. So I think thinking about how, to use another kind of academic term, how people write back to establish scholarship is really important, especially when you're talking
Mhm.
about sex and the body. And Hooks is a really important thinker and an important scholar, and I definitely recommend reading her work because I like to read it. It's a pleasure to read rather than like a slog to read, if that makes sense. So
Mhm.
that's kind of where I was coming from. Like, a lot of people think about Mulvey only when they think about the male gaze, so I wanted to make sure I was having a conversation around and beyond that in thinking of my own understanding of the female gaze. So yeah, you had pulled some great quotes for Hooks that, as I was reading, I was kind of like responding to. Like, I haven't read the article before, I haven't read the piece before. But is there
She
one that
has
you—
read the piece before.
I
She's the one who
have,
said
I
it to
have.
me.
Yes, it's it's my scan of the piece. But is there one that you'd like to highlight for the purpose, or, well, actually, rewind. When we say the oppositional gaze, it kind of feels like what that is right on the tin, but how would we describe that kind of in the same way we've been thinking about the male gaze?
So, the way that I'm understanding it from Bell Hooks is the oppositional gaze is, so I'm going to give two sort of definitions here.
Yeah, go for it.
One is when you look, the object, or the person who is an object of the gaze and is not
Mhm.
supposed to look back does.
Mhm,
Uh,
mhm,
so like the example that I struck me as a childhood studies scholar, that Hook starts with is that children are not supposed to look at adults
mhm,
necessarily. And then she connects it to slavery and how enslaved people were not allowed to like look back at the
mhm,
master. But then
mhm,
she says, well, I knew as a child that I certainly snuck looks at adults when I shouldn't. So I'm sure that enslaved people did as
mhm,
well.
mhm,
So she talks about that as like, so she says like that all attempts to repress our slash black people's right to gaze had produced in us an overwhelming longing to look, a rebellious
mhm,
desire, an oppositional gaze. So it's a
mhm,
gaze that is
mhm,
in opposition. So she's thinking there about gazing and looking not necessarily just in the context of film, but more
mhm,
generally as
mhm.
who has the right to perceive
Right. Who has the
almost.
right to look? Yeah, I think who has the right to perceive is a great way to put it. And kind of returning to my conversation of what the gaze is kind of this like background conversation that we all have running in our brains. Hooks has kind of a quote here for a little later in the article that mass media was a system of knowledge and power reproducing and maintaining white supremacy. So, something to think about is like, when we're filtering all of this information and that codes how we read and watch and listen to and understand things, the negative parts of our societies are in there as well. Actually, I mean, this is not one to one, but kind of thinking about all the conversations about AI right now, and AI
Mhm.
training might be an interesting kind of like relation to the gaze because it's the same kind of filtering of what we put into it, right? Who's feeding the data in, and then what does that end up producing out, in a sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I'm gonna build on that a little bit, and
Yeah, go
because
ahead.
the quote that you like specifically, that's where Hooks is transitioning into thinking about film and mass media and whose perspective is being centered, and this is where she's adding some complexity into like the idea of the gaze by saying like it's not just men, it's not just the patriarchy.
Right.
It is specifically white supremacy that is being perpetuated by and not always in like obvious ways. Like this isn't just like characters, I don't know, using slurs. That's not what she means.
Right.
It's
No,
like
it's much bigger than that.
it's this larger systemic like assumption of who is looking, who is being looked at, whose stories are being told. Like one of the things Hooks goes on to say is that like Black women are largely absent from a lot of the mainstream cinema that she's talking about here. Not just as like people looking, but also as the object of desire, which is very often a particular kind of white woman.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, my brain is just connecting dots, not to pull away too much from Hooks, but something this makes me think about. In doing my keyword essay, I was thinking about who is allowed to be desired, right? And who do we place focus on when it comes to desire and desiring. And I was reading this book about heartthrobs in romance. And it really struck me that there was only one chapter that really thought about non-white romance leads. And I think in total, I think I said there was like 4 pages that was related to Black presses for Black readers in a 150, 200 page book, right? And that the majority of the conversation in this chapter was about white women who were then in Asian context and swept away by some kind of sultan. So there was this kind of
so that gets it a little bit
exoticized
into
other.
Orientalism a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So just thinking a bit about what you just said. Sorry, I'll bring it back.
I mean,
I'll bring it back.
I think that's interesting because it also adds complexity. Because when we think about Mulvey and the male gaze, I think there is a temptation that I often fall prey to be like male gaze equals bad.
Right.
Being gazed at, bad. I do not wish to be perceived. But I think there is also, it is important to add that complication of who is even deemed worthy of being gazed at.
Right.
It's not just that we need to get rid of the gaze. It is worth thinking about both ends of it in that sort of power dynamic, but also in who
Absolutely.
is deemed desirable and worth looking at in the first place.
Absolutely. And then how they are then treated, right? Or ranked in the media that we create.
Yeah, and there is like this question of like if being desirable and being gazed at is can it be empowering or is it just objectifying?
And so you're also using objectifying negatively, right?
I am.
Which I think is interesting because like I'm trying to think of an example here. You know what? I'm going to use an example that I texted you about. Oh God, what did I say? It was something really silly, but like I look at hot people all the time. You know what I mean? And granted, this is taking the gaze and making it individual, right? Because I'm only in control of my own body. If I see a hot person running down the street, I might be like, wow, that's a really hot person. But I think there's a difference between taking a look on the street and then going and saying, feeling like I can act on my objectification in a way that makes somebody else comfortable, right? But is what I'm doing not objectifying them in a sense?
Well, it's kind of like because the word that I'm thinking here is maybe like admiring or like checking someone out versus like.
But what's the difference?
What if you're seeing that person as an object or as someone with like their own agency?
Okay. So agency, coming back to the active and passive here. Making the connection.
An object doesn't have agency. That's the problem.
Very true. That's very true. So is this a question of, not to get too heady about it, but is it the question of that we use how we talk about desiring and how we talk about active desiring kind of comes down to the terms that we decide to use, right? Because I think you're right. If you say admiring or checking out, then that has a softer connotation than objectification, right? Because you're not turning into an object. But I don't know. Part of me feels like on the ground, a lot of it is the same. But words are important, so I'm not saying like we shouldn't choose the words we use carefully, right? But I think maybe you're right. Maybe the connotation of like the flattening of objectification, the turning of into an object that you can then do with what you want is what makes it negative.
Well, and thinking about that, like, it also has something to do, I think, with the assumption of having the right to look
Mhm.
in a way that,
Mhm.
like, I don't always this is maybe a little bit silly and certainly detached from
No, go
cinema,
ahead.
but, like, the general social culture, so I lived in Poland for a year, like, they really don't check people out in, like, the same sort of obvious way that we do in the United States, and I'm not saying that, like,
Mm.
they don't find people attractive, because I'm certain I'm sure they do, but, like, I got used to not being looked at in a way that made me feel sexualized while I lived in Poland, and when I came back to the States and there were people and men who, like,
Mhm.
just looked at me and assumed that they had the right to look, it was
Mhm.
unsettling to me in a way that it wasn't before I, like, got used to something
Mhm.
else.
I'm sorry, this is not the trend of the conversation. I'll bring it back after this, but I'm just thinking about the intensity of a stare versus a
Mhm.
look, right? Because I think the time someone spends looking, because there's leering is different than looking, is different than
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't
Well,
know.
it's almost like I mean, I use the term admiring, but that is almost more like it has a more respectful connotation to
Yeah,
it
no,
almost than, like,
yeah.
feeling like I'm being objectified
Being watched.
versus
Mhm.
feeling like someone thinks I'm pretty. I don't know, like
Yeah. Yeah. This is in part why the podcast is not an article, but is a
it's a
vibe because
vibe.
I feel like we're thinking through these things are complicated and complex, right? And this is something I think about all the time, especially as someone who studies like erotic material, right? Is that you're reading about people like when we look at naked bodies, yes, sometimes it's to be like, wow, this is amazing art, and sometimes it's to be like, yeah, that
That's
turns me
hot.
on. That's hot. That turns me on. And I don't think we shouldn't demonize that. And that's just something kind of I think about when we think about the male gaze is like part of the problem is that it's not equitable, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And the kinds of media that we get, it's not a flat, even plane that we're getting representation of all different kinds, right? But I don't know. My gut is just like the male gaze isn't inherently a negative thing, but the fact that it is so constantly deployed and the assumptions that it makes it negative. Which is why someone like or the work that Hooks did in this essay is super important.
Yeah, so sort of maybe recapping that a little bit. Like
Yes, please.
the problem with the male gaze is when it's the only gaze that's allowed and assumed and the
Mhm.
only
Mhm.
gaze that we are trained to deploy
Right.
by the media that we are consuming. That
Yeah.
trains us how not just how to consume media, but how to look at and interact with the world.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the fact that it inscribes this active passive dynamic
Mhm.
as part of that training and then it makes a group of people essentially inactive and takes their agency
Yeah, it's
away.
like who it puts in the position of power in this binary, and that
Yeah.
is straight white men. And then the object then in the lesser position in the binary is straight white women, which then leaves a whole bunch of people out of
Right.
the equation
Mhm.
altogether.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. So, as we often do, we're going to be breaking this into two parts. That wasn't the original plan, but
I don't know. We kind of thought it would be a thing that happened as previously established. When we say we will be brief, we are lying.
oh, boom, bring it all the way back. So, we're going to stop the conversation here
Pause
and
rather than stop.
oh, pause. Yes. Language again is very important. We're going to pause the conversation here and then restart, I think, leaning maybe directly into the female gaze, kind of
Yeah.
based on this groundwork that we've set.
All right, next episode we will hit the ground running with the female gaze.
So, since we're wrapping up, Corinne, where can people find us on the internet?
You can find us at SexLoveLit on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads now. We'll see how long that lasts as an app that people use.
Dramatic shrug. I have no idea.
But of those, the best place to interact with us is probably Instagram.
Sounds good.
All right. Bye.
For now. Pew, pew.